There are gods in Norse myth who rule from halls of gold, who command thunder, kingship, beauty, or fertility. And then there are figures like Skadi, who seem to come out of a harsher world entirely. Not out of banquet halls or bright courts, but out of rock, snow, hunger, and distance. Skadi is one of the sharpest presences in the Norse imagination because she does not enter the story as a passive goddess waiting to be named or claimed. She arrives armed, she arrives grieving, and she arrives ready to make the gods answer for blood. That alone tells you what kind of force she is. Not a soft seasonal mascot, not a neat symbol of winter in the modern decorative sense. Skadi belongs to the mountains, to the hunt, to snow travel, and to the dangerous line where the world of the gods meets the world beyond their walls. This is Warrior Shaman Chronicles, where we cut through the watered-down versions and go back to the old stories with a colder eye and a steadier hand. And with Skadi, that matters, because nearly everything we know about her comes through late Icelandic sources written down in the 13th century. Chiefly the Poetic Edda, which preserves older verse in a later manuscript, and the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson in Christian Iceland as a guide to old poetic tradition. That means the myths are old, but the written record is late. So the right way to approach Skadi is not with fake certainty, but with respect for the sources and a willingness to separate what the texts clearly say from the modern bullshit layered on top of them. Skadi's story begins with a killing. Her father was Thiazi, the giant who became entangled in the myth of Idun, the keeper of the apples that preserve the god's youth. According to Skaldskaparmal, Loki's dealings with Thiazi helped lead to Idun's abduction, and when the gods finally recovered her, Thiazi was killed at Asgard's edge. That death is what brings Skadi into the story. She does not come to Asgard as a guest. She comes as a daughter with a blood claim. The text is explicit. She takes helmet, mail, and weapons of war and goes to avenge her father. That image matters more than any tidy label. Before she is wife, goddess, or symbol, she is an armed avenger walking into the stronghold of the Aesir and forcing them to deal with her on serious terms. And the gods do deal with her. They do not dismiss her as irrelevant. They negotiate. The settlement they offer is one of the strangest and most memorable in Norse myth. First, Skadi may choose a husband from among the gods, but only by looking at their feet. She sees the most beautiful feet and thinks she has chosen Balder, the shining one. Instead, the feet belong to Njord, god of the sea and shore. Then comes the second condition. The gods must make her laugh. Loki, in typical Loki fashion, accomplishes it through absurd humiliation, and Skadi finally laughs in spite of herself. And then comes the most haunting part of the atonement. Odin takes Thiazi's eyes and casts them into the heavens as stars. So the myth does not end with simple vengeance. It turns grief into settlement, death into memory, and private loss into cosmic sign. But the marriage at the center of that settlement is doomed from the beginning because Njord and Skadi belong to different worlds. In the younger Edda, Njord is tied to Noatun, the shore, the sea, the winds, and the wealth of coastal life. Skadi prefers Thrymheim, the mountain home that had belonged to her father. They attempt a compromise, spending part of their time in the mountains and part by the sea. It fails hard. Njord cannot stand the mountain world. The wolves and the upland cold grate on him. Skadi cannot sleep by the coast. The cries of seabirds and the restless shore drive her mad. So they part. And in that failed union, the myth says something brutally honest. Not all opposites reconcile. Sometimes coast and mountain remain coast and mountain. Sometimes two powers can meet, bargain, even marry, and still never truly belong to one another. That is why it is better to think of Skadi not as a generic winter goddess, but as a figure rooted in a particular way of life. The sources connect her with mountains, archery hunting, snow travel, and the chase of wild beasts. In the younger Edda tradition, after leaving Njord, she returns to Thrymheim, straps on her snow skates or skis, takes up her bow, and hunts. One source even preserves an epithet that later translators render as something like the snowshoe or ski goddess. That is a very different image from the polished fantasy version people often carry around now. Skadi is not cozy. She is not ornamental. She is competence in hard terrain. She is a divine presence shaped by upland winter, mobility over snow, and the ability to survive where softer people would die. There is another reason Skadi matters, and it is deeper than aesthetics. She comes from the Jotnar, the giant kindred, yet she moves among the gods and forces her way into their world. That matters, because Norse myth is not built on a cheap good versus evil split. The Jotnar are enemies at times, kin at others, rivals, in-laws, ancestors, and necessary counterparts. The boundaries are real, but they are porous. Skadi stands right on that edge. Her father is killed by the gods, yet she is brought into the divine order through settlement. She is both outsider and insider, both giant-born and counted among the powers. In that sense, she embodies one of the oldest truths in Norse myth. Order is never clean. It is built by contest, bargain, blood debt, and uneasy coexistence with the forces outside the walls. The historical side of this story matters too. We do not have a neat pagan handbook from the Viking Age telling us exactly how every Norse person understood Skadi or how widely she was worshipped. What we have are literary sources written down in Christian Iceland, preserving older poetic material and older mythic memory, but doing so through late hands. That should make us cautious. It should not make us cynical. The late record still preserves a consistent image. Skadi is tied to Thrymheim, to the memory of Thiazi, to the failed marriage with Njord, and to a mode of life centered on mountains, hunting, and snow. The myth's geography is not random. It reflects a northern world where landscape mattered, where livelihood depended on terrain, and where the difference between coast and upland was not poetic decoration, but a real distinction in how human beings lived. There are also later strands of tradition that keep her edges sharp. In material associated with Loki's punishment, Skadi is the one who sets the venomous snake above him so that poison drips down on his face. Whether every detail of that wider punishment narrative belongs to the oldest layer is a separate question, but the association fits her. Even among the gods, Skadi does not become soft. She remains a force linked to retribution, severity, and the raw side of justice. That is part of why she still feels alive. She's not absorbed into courtly order. She remains mountain-born in temperament even when she enters Asgard's orbit. She carries the wilderness with her, and that, more than anything, is why Skadi endures. She is one of the few figures in Norse mythology who still feels untamed even after the story tries to settle her. She loses a father, marches on the gods, wins terms, enters a marriage, rejects a world that does not fit her, and returns to the high country with bow and snow underfoot. She is not defined by domesticity. She is not remembered because she was agreeable. She is remembered because she could not be reduced. In a mythic world full of kings, thunderers, tricksters, and doomed heroes, Skadi stands for something older and colder, the sovereignty of wild ground, the dignity of grief that does not beg, and the kind of endurance shaped by stone, winter, and the hunt. So when you hear Skadi called a winter goddess, that is not exactly wrong, but it is too thin to matter. The better image is this: a giant-born huntress crossing snow with a bow in hand, walking into the hall of the gods to demand payment, then turning her back on the sea and returning to the mountains because that is where she truly belongs. That is Skadi as the sources leave her to us. Not tame, not simple, not sentimental. A figure of wilderness, distance, and hard sovereignty, and that makes her one of the most northern presences in all Norse myth. This has been Warrior Shaman Chronicles. If you want the old stories with their teeth still in them, stay with me. There is more ahead.